high in the mountains of the Philippines live a people whose DNA has honestly baffled scientists for years. The Igorots, known for their strength, mountain wisdom, and ancient traditions, carry genetic signatures that just don't fully match any other group in Asia. Some researchers even say their DNA may hold clues to one of humanity's oldest migrations. In the northern highlands of the Philippines, where clouds touch ancient terraces and rivers carve deep into the Cordillera Mountains, the Igorots have lived for thousands of years. They are farmers, warriors, and builders, the creators of the Banawe rice terraces, one of the greatest engineering feats in human history. But beyond their cultural achievements lies something even more mysterious: the story written in their DNA. Because when scientists studied the genetics of the Igorots, they found something that didn't quite fit, traces that seem far older, more isolated, and more complex than anyone expected. The word Igorot means, well, people of the mountains. It refers to several related groups in the Cordillera region: the Ifugao, Bontoc, Kankanaey, Ibaloy, Kalinga, and others. For generations they lived in steep valleys, cultivating rice on terraces carved by hand into the mountainsides. This isolation preserved not only their culture, but also their unique genetics. When outsiders arrived, from lowland kingdoms, then from Spain, the Igorots stood their ground. They resisted colonization for more than 300 years, protecting both their independence and their ancient bloodlines. That resilience allowed modern scientists to study something rare, an almost untouched genetic window into the ancient Philippines. When DNA researchers began comparing the Igorot genome to those of other Filipinos and Asian populations, they made a surprising discovery. The Igorots had the least amount of foreign genetic influence of any major group in the Philippines. While most lowland Filipinos showed mixtures of Austronesian, Malay, Chinese, and even Spanish ancestry, Igorot DNA was remarkably distinct. Some parts of their genome looked like they had been isolated for thousands of years, surviving from a time before Austronesian seafarers arrived. In other words, the Igorots may represent one of the oldest continuous genetic lineages in the entire region. For decades, historians believed that the ancestors of modern Filipinos arrived from Taiwan about 4,000 years ago, part of the so-called Austronesian expansion which spread across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. But Igorot DNA suggests a more complex story. Genetic studies published in the past decade reveal that while Igorots share some Austronesian ancestry, they also carry deep-rooted markers that predate that migration. These markers trace back over 10,000 years, possibly even 15,000, to an earlier wave of settlers in the islands. That makes the Igorots not simply descendants of the Austronesians, but possibly the inheritors of even older, pre-Austronesian bloodlines that mixed with later arrivals. This could explain why their language, traditions, and appearance have distinct differences from neighboring groups. One of the biggest questions scientists asked was, how did Igorot DNA stay so well preserved for such a long time? The answer lies in geography and culture. The Cordillera Mountains are rugged, steep, and difficult to access. Even today it takes hours to travel from one valley to another. In ancient times, this natural barrier kept the Igorots largely separated from lowland populations. They built strong, self-sufficient communities. Marriages were mostly within the same groups, and cultural customs discouraged assimilation with outsiders. Over centuries, this isolation worked like a time capsule, freezing their DNA in a state close to that of early Philippine settlers. But, that's not the only mystery. When scientists compared Igorot DNA to other Asian populations, they noticed similarities that were honestly pretty unexpected. Some markers overlapped slightly with ancient Taiwanese and South Chinese lineages, consistent with the Austronesian expansion, but others matched populations much farther south, in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and even Australia's Aboriginal peoples. This suggests that Igorot ancestors were part of ancient migrations that moved through Southeast Asia tens of thousands of years ago, long before written history. In other words, the Igorots may be direct descendants of the region's earliest mountain peoples who adapted to highland life, while others spread to the coasts and islands. Another fascinating discovery was traces of Denisovan DNA. That's the genetic imprint of an extinct human species that once roamed Asia. Filipinos, especially indigenous groups like the Aita and Igorot, have some of the highest levels of Denisovan ancestry found anywhere in the world. This means that before modern humans fully settled the Philippines, their ancestors interbred with Denisovans, ancient cousins of humans, tens of thousands of years ago. Those interactions left behind genes related to immunity, metabolism, and adaptation to altitude, traits that may have helped Igorot ancestors survive in their rugged environment. It's poetic. The very DNA that allowed them to thrive in the mountains may come from an ancient species that no longer exists. But the Igorot story isn't just about DNA, it's about how culture protected that DNA. While many ancient civilizations vanished, the Igorots held on. They preserved rituals honoring ancestors and nature. They practiced community-based agriculture and maintained spiritual connection to their land. In their view, the mountains are sacred, not just home, but a living ancestor. That worldview created a cultural wall that protected their traditions and, by extension, their genetic heritage. Every rice terrace, every stone wall, every ritual chant is a piece of living anthropology. Proof that heritage isn't just written in genes, but in how people live. Today, geneticists, historians, and anthropologists are working together to trace these connections. Using genome sequencing, isotope dating, and archaeological digs, they're building a clearer picture of how ancient Filipinos evolved and spread. What's remarkable is how Igorot DNA consistently shows the least external mixing, making it invaluable to understanding what the first Filipinos were really like. This research doesn't reduce Igorot identity to genetics. Instead, it highlights how science is finally catching up to what many Igorots already knew. Their roots run deep, older than any empire, older than colonization, and older than recorded history. Understanding the Igorot genome isn't just scientific curiosity, it changes how we see Filipino identity as a whole. For centuries, colonizers described the islands as primitive or disconnected, but in reality, the Philippines holds some of the oldest, most continuous human lineages in Asia. It means that Filipino ancestry didn't begin with outsiders, it began here. It also means that every Filipino today, no matter their mix, carries a spark of that ancient story. The Igorot DNA that science still can't fully explain reminds us that the story of humanity is still being written, not in textbooks, but in living people. In the mountains of the Cordillera, the Igorots carry within them echoes of the first travelers who left Africa, crossed the islands, and built a life among the clouds. Their DNA is not a mystery because it's strange, it's a mystery because it's pure. It's a living record of who we were, long before nations and borders existed. And as the world continues to uncover its ancient past, one truth stands firm. The mountains of the Philippines hold not just terraces and traditions, but the keys to one of humanity's oldest and most enduring lineages.